I'm going to tell you about a fishing crew that hasn't returned to a specific set of coordinates in the North Atlantic for 2 years. Not because the fishing is poor there, not because of equipment failure or weather patterns. They won't go back because of what came up in their net on June 14th, 2022, and what rose from the water afterward to take it back. The captain, a man with 37 years of commercial fishing experience, described the moment the winch strained under unexpected weight. His crew had pulled up everything the ocean offers: sharks tangled in webbing, giant squid, once even an unexploded mine from some forgotten war. But when the net broke the surface that afternoon, it held something that made sounds like a human infant crying. Not similar to it, exactly like it. What happened in the following 18 minutes has left 4 witnesses who refuse to speak publicly, but whose private accounts align on every significant detail. They describe the juvenile creature with its translucent webbing and 2 intelligent eyes. They describe the calls it made and the answers that came from the surrounding water. And they describe the shapes that surfaced in a calculated circle around their vessel, close enough that they could see faces. 3 of them sold their boats within the month. The 4th still fishes but carries a logbook with those coordinates marked in red ink with a single word: never. This is their account of what happened when they accidentally caught something that wasn't supposed to exist and discovered that its family was willing to surface to get it back. The ocean is not empty. This is the first truth every commercial fisherman learns, and the last one they forget. 70% of Earth's surface lies beneath salt water, and we have explored less than 5% of it. We have mapped the moon's craters with greater precision than our own ocean floor. We have sent probes to the frozen moons of Jupiter while leaving the Mariana Trench largely unexamined. The deep remains the largest contiguous wilderness on the planet, and it is not ours. Commercial fishing vessels operate in this profound isolation. 20, sometimes 40 miles from the nearest shore, surrounded by water deep enough to swallow mountains, the crew exists in a space where help is theoretical, and survival depends entirely on the integrity of steel and the competence of men. The engine noise becomes a heartbeat. The horizon forms a perfect circle with your vessel at its center, and that circle moves with you, unchanging until the mathematics of distance render land irrelevant. The physical reality is extreme. Salt corrodes everything metal. The sun reflects off water until vision blurs. Cold seeps through layers of clothing and settles in bone. The smell becomes inseparable from your skin. Diesel fuel, fish blood, brine, the peculiar rot of seaweed. Your hands crack and bleed. Your back develops a permanent ache from bracing against the deck's motion. Sleep comes in fractured intervals between hauls, never long enough, never deep enough. But the psychological weight exceeds the physical. You work atop an abyss. Beneath the hull lies water measured in thousands of feet, extending down into absolute darkness, where pressure would collapse your lungs like paper bags. Anything could exist in that volume. Entire ecosystems we have never documented. Species that have never seen sunlight. And the ocean keeps its secrets with a patience that outlasts human lifespans. We discover new species regularly. In 2021, researchers identified 40 new marine species in a single expedition. In 2023, cameras captured footage of a fish at depths previously considered uninhabitable by vertebrates. These are not small revelations hidden in academic journals. These are fundamental revisions to what we believed possible. The colossal squid, a creature reaching 46 feet in length, was confirmed to exist only in 2007. Before that, it occupied the same category as sea serpents. Rumored, unverified, probably mythical. The deep ocean presents conditions we cannot replicate in laboratories. Temperatures near freezing. Pressure exceeding 8 tons per square inch. Complete absence of light. Yet life persists there, adapted in ways that seem alien. Bioluminescence, transparent flesh, eyes the size of dinner plates, jaws that unhinge to swallow prey larger than the predator's own body. We have recorded sounds in the deep that match no known species. We have found structures on the seafloor that resemble tools. We have documented behavior that suggests communication, planning, memory. The fishing crew at the center of this account understood these realities intimately. They had worked these waters for decades collectively. They had seen things that unsettled them, masses of bioluminescent plankton that turned the night ocean into green fire, whale carcasses sinking into the depths while clouds of scavengers materialized from nowhere, sudden swells that appeared from calm water as if something massive had moved just beneath the surface. They had learned the difference between the ocean's normal mysteries and something wrong. On the morning of June 14th, 2022, they noticed the wrongness immediately. The water was too still, not calm, still. No chop, no swell, just a glassy flatness that extended to the horizon. The birds that usually followed the boat, waiting for scraps, had disappeared. The fish finder showed nothing, not even the background scatter of plankton that should have been constant. One crew member described it as fishing in dead water, a term old sailors used for regions where ships would become becalmed and supplies would run out before wind returned. They had already made the decision to move to different coordinates when the net, on what was meant to be a final exploratory haul, went heavy. Sailors have believed in merfolk since humans first built vessels, capable of leaving sight of land. This is not a regional superstition or a relic of one culture's mythology. It is a global constant that appears in maritime traditions from every seafaring civilization in recorded history, often with unsettling consistency in the details. The ancient Assyrians worshipped Atargatis, a goddess with the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a fish, as early as 1000 BCE. Greek sailors recorded encounters with sirens, creatures depicted in early accounts not as bird women, but as fish-tailed beings whose songs could compel men to drown themselves. Roman natural historians, including Pliny the Elder, documented reports of merfolk as observable fact, not allegory. Medieval European sailors consistently reported sightings, describing them in ship logs with the same clinical detail they used for documenting weather and position. The reports share common elements across cultures that had no contact with each other: Japanese Ningyo, Polynesian spirits of the reef, West African Mamiwata, Scottish Selkies, and Slavic Rusalka all describe intelligent humanoids living in water, capable of speech, possessing emotions, and responding to human presence with intention. They are not depicted as animals. They are framed as a separate category of being, non-human, but not mindless, aquatic but not alien. Christopher Columbus recorded in his log on January 9, 1493, that he and his crew had seen 3 mermaids rise high out of the sea near Haiti. He noted they were not as beautiful as they are painted, although to some extent they have a human appearance in the face. Later analysis has attempted to explain this as a misidentification of manatees. But Columbus had seen manatees before and had described them accurately in earlier entries. Whatever he saw that day, he distinguished it from known marine mammals. Henry Hudson's crew aboard the Hopewell reported a mermaid sighting in 1608 in the Arctic Ocean. 2 experienced sailors described a creature with pale skin, long black hair, and a tail like a porpoise, which swam alongside the ship for several minutes before diving. These were not superstitious men prone to fantasy. They were professional navigators whose survival depended on accurate observation. The consistency extends to behavior. Across these accounts, merfolk are described as protective of their young, curious about humans but wary, and capable of retaliation when threatened. Scottish Selkie legends specifically warn against capturing sealfolk children, recounting stories of entire fishing villages destroyed by storms after a Selkie infant was taken. Polynesian oral traditions describe reef spirits who would sink canoes that harvested too many fish from protected waters. Japanese fishermen observe rituals to appease ningyo and avoid accidentally netting them, believing that catching one brought catastrophic misfortune. The scientific establishment has consistently dismissed these accounts as misidentification. Seals, particularly from a distance or in poor light, can appear humanoid when they surface vertically. Manatees nurse their young while holding them with flippers in a way that resembles a woman cradling an infant. Dugongs, the likely origin of some mermaid legends, have forward-facing teats and vaguely human-looking faces. Exhaustion, dehydration, and isolation can produce hallucinations. Mass hysteria can spread through a ship's crew. But dismissal requires ignoring the volume and specificity of the reports. It requires assuming that experienced mariners across centuries and continents consistently misidentified the same animals in the same ways. It requires believing that cultures with no contact somehow invented identical folklore. And it requires ignoring a simpler possibility: that sailors reported these encounters because they happened. The ocean conceals effectively. A species that avoided human contact, that lived primarily in deep water and surfaced, rarely could remain unverified indefinitely. We have no comprehensive catalog of marine life. New species of large marine animals are discovered regularly, species that presumably existed all along but remained outside human observation. The coelacanth, a fish believed extinct for 66 million years, was found alive in 1938. If a 6-foot fish could evade detection that thoroughly, what else could? The crew that made the catch in June 2022 knew these stories. Commercial fishermen inherit the superstitions of their profession. They learn not to whistle aboard ship because it summons wind. They avoid sailing on Fridays. They never bring bananas on a boat. Some of these beliefs have practical origins, but others exist because generations of sailors have observed that certain actions precede certain consequences, even when the mechanism remains unexplained. When their net surfaced that afternoon, their first response was not wonder. It was recognition. They had heard the stories, and now the stories were thrashing in their net, making sounds that would follow them into sleep for months afterward. The net came up wrong. Marco Silva had worked commercial fishing boats for 17 years. He knew the difference between a full haul and a snag. He knew how tuna fought versus marlin, how a shark thrashed versus a ray. This was none of those things. The winch motor groaned. The cables went taut in a way that suggested massive weight, but the resistance felt deliberate. Not the panic of trapped fish, not the inert drag of debris. The net was moving against them with what Silva later described as calculated strength. "Cut it," the deckhand said. His name was Tommy Chen. Both hands on the rail, knuckles white. "Whatever that is, cut it loose." The captain overrode him. They were 3 days into a run that had yielded almost nothing. The winch continued. When the net finally broke the surface, the water around it churned. Not splashing, churning. The movement was confined to a specific radius, as if something inside understood the boundaries of its prison and was testing them. They hauled it onto the deck. The crew went silent. The creature lay tangled in the net's center. Perhaps 4 feet in length, its lower body was streamlined and powerful, covered in smooth skin that caught the light like wet rubber. Gray-blue, mottled with darker patches. Where the torso began, the anatomy shifted. The rib cage was visible beneath the skin, rising and falling rapidly. The arms were too long, ending in hands with 5 distinct fingers connected by thin webbing. The face made 3 crew members step back. It had the proportions of a human toddler, large eyes set in a rounded skull, but the eyes themselves were black and enormous, with no visible white. They tracked the men with unmistakable awareness. Then it made a sound, a high-pitched wail. It sounded like a human infant crying, the exact pitch and rhythm of a baby in distress. Silva crouched beside the net. The creature's eyes locked onto his. There was intelligence there, not animal cunning, something that recognized him as another thinking being. The small chest continued to heave. The cry intensified. "It's suffocating," Silva said. "It's a seal," the captain said. His voice carried no conviction. "Some kind of deformed seal. Seals don't have hands." The creature's fingers were curling and uncurling. One hand found a section of net and gripped it. The knuckles worked exactly like a human child's. Chen had his phone out, filming. His hands shook badly. "We need to get it back in the water," Silva said. "We need to get it to shore," another deckhand countered. Ross, the youngest crew member, 23. "Do you understand what this is? This is proof." "This is dying," Silva said. He pulled at the net. The creature thrashed when his hands came close, but the movement was weakening. The cries were becoming softer. The enormous eyes were starting to film over. Silva got his knife out. He began cutting the net away. The creature went very still. It watched the blade. It watched his face. When a section fell free, it didn't try to escape. It remained motionless, tracking Silva's movements. The captain grabbed Silva's shoulder. "Stop! We need to think about this." "It's a baby," Silva said. That was when the other sounds started. From the water came a series of calls, high and low frequencies alternating in complex patterns, something structured that suggested language. The creature on deck responded. Its cries shifted in pitch and rhythm, call and response. Chen dropped his phone. The crew moved to the rails. Beneath the surface, shapes were moving, large shapes, multiple contacts circling the vessel at varying depths. "How many?" the captain asked. No one answered. The shapes moved with precision, maintaining specific distances from the hull. The pattern suggested coordination. Silva looked down at the creature. It had gone completely silent. The enormous eyes were fixed on him, waiting. His hands started moving down. The knife cut through the remaining net. The creature came free. He lifted it. The skin was cold and smooth, perhaps 30 pounds. The small hands gripped his forearms. The fingers pressed into his skin with undeniable purpose. "Marco, don't," the captain said. Silva carried the creature to the rail. The calls from the water intensified. The circling shapes drew closer, sleek forms just beneath the surface, larger than any seal, moving too deliberately to be sharks. He held the creature out over the water. It looked at him, one final time. The black eyes reflected the dying light. Then it twisted in his grip with sudden, violent strength and dove. The splash was small. The creature vanished immediately. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the water erupted. Silva stepped back from the rail. The ocean around the boat was moving. Not waves, not current. Purposeful displacement. The shapes that had been circling at depth were rising. They broke the surface in unison. 6 of them. 7. The crew couldn't get an accurate count, but there were at least 6 distinct entities surrounding the vessel. The adults were nothing like the juvenile. They were massive. The visible portions suggested lengths between 7 and 9 feet. Their builds were powerful and streamlined, built for deep water, built for speed. The coloring was similar to the juvenile, mottled gray-blue, but their proportions were entirely different. The torso-to-tail ratio favored power. Their shoulders were broad and muscled. Their arms showed definition that spoke to strength far beyond human capability. But it was the faces that made Ross turn away from the rail. They had retained more of their humanity than their bodies had. The skulls were elongated and the features flattened, but the basic architecture was recognizable. Eyes, nose, mouth in the expected configuration. The eyes were still large and black, but set in faces that conveyed unmistakable expression. They were furious. "Start the engine," Chen said. The captain was already moving toward the wheelhouse. His hands hit the ignition. The engine turned over once, then died. He tried again. The motor ground but wouldn't catch. One of the creatures surfaced directly beside the hull, close enough that the crew could see the detail of its face. It turned its head and looked up at them. The movement was slow and deliberate. It maintained eye contact with Ross for 5 full seconds before sinking again. "They cut something," Ross said. "They cut a line, or they're holding the prop. We're not moving." Silva was still at the rail where he had released the juvenile. The adult creature's face had been female. He was certain of that. The features had been refined in a way that registered as feminine, even across species boundaries. And the expression had been absolutely clear. Recognition, assessment, judgment. "Marco," the captain called. "Get away from the edge." Silva didn't move. He was watching the water. The creatures had descended again, but he could track their shapes moving beneath the boat. They were doing something to the hull, inspecting it. One shape moved from bow to stern in a straight line, as if conducting a survey. "What do they want?" Chen asked. No one answered. Everyone knew what they wanted. They wanted to know if the humans were a threat. They wanted to decide what to do about the transgression. The boat rocked. Something had struck the hull, not hard enough to breach it, but with enough force to register as a warning. Ross had his phone out now. He was dialing. His hands were shaking. "No signal," he said. "We're 3 miles out," the captain said. "There's never signal." "Radio then. Call the Coast Guard." "And tell them what?" Ross opened his mouth, closed it. His face had gone pale. The boat rocked again. Harder this time. Silva finally moved away from the rail. He crossed the deck to where the captain stood. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only the captain could hear. "We took one of their children. We didn't know. They don't care what we knew." The captain looked at him. The man was 54 years old. He had worked fishing vessels since he was 16. He had been through hurricanes and equipment failures and Coast Guard boardings. Silva had never seen fear in his face until now. "What do we do?" the captain asked. Silva had no answer. This wasn't weather or mechanical failure or even hostile human actors. This was a negotiation with an intelligence they couldn't communicate with over a violation they hadn't known they were committing. Another sound came from the water, a long descending tone. It was picked up by other voices and repeated in a round. The pattern was complex, definitely linguistic. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the calls had been. Chen had moved to the opposite rail. He was looking down into the water. "They're leaving," he said. Silva joined him. Chen was right. The shapes were moving away from the boat, descending as they went. Within 20 seconds, there were no visible contacts. The water had returned to its normal state. The captain tried the engine again. It caught immediately. The crew stood motionless for a long moment. No one spoke. Ross broke the silence. "Did that just happen?" Chen laughed. It was a high, brittle sound with no humor in it. "No, we have it on video. Show that video to anyone, and they'll call it a hoax or CGI, or we'll lose our licenses for filing a false report." "We don't talk about this," the captain said. "What?" "We don't talk about this. We don't file a report. We don't post videos. We came out The fishing was bad. We went home. That's the story. You can't be serious. Look at me, Ross. Do I look like I'm joking? We pulled something out of the ocean that shouldn't exist. Its family came for it. They disabled our boat without leaving a mark. They could have sunk us. They could have pulled us into the water, one by one. They didn't. They let us go. And now we're going to pretend it never happened, because if we don't, no one will believe us anyway. And we'll spend the rest of our careers being the guys who cried mermaid. Ross looked at Chen. Chen looked at Silva. Silva nodded slowly. He's right. The captain turned the boat toward shore. The engine ran smoothly. Whatever the creatures had done to disable it had been temporary. A demonstration of capability. A warning. The sun finished setting. The deck lights came on. The crew stood in small clusters, not talking, not meeting each other's eyes. Silva looked at his hands. The marks from the juvenile's grip were already fading. In a few hours, he would start to wonder if they had ever been there. In a few days, the memory would begin to feel unreal. But standing on the deck in the dark, with the engine carrying them away from the site of the encounter, he was certain of what he had seen. They had crossed a boundary. They had been judged. They had been spared. The creatures had let them go with a certainty they would never be able to share. The ocean held intelligence humanity had not discovered. And those intelligences knew about us. The boat pushed through the dark water toward distant lights. No one spoke until they reached the harbor. The creature began making noise approximately 17 minutes after it came aboard. The crew had been standing in a loose semicircle around the net, none of them willing to approach, none of them willing to look away. Marcus had tried twice to raise the harbor master on the radio. Both times he'd stopped mid-transmission, unable to find words that wouldn't make him sound like he'd lost his mind. Then the thing in the net opened its mouth and the sound that came out stopped all of them cold. It started as a clicking, rapid, rhythmic, precise. Not the random thrashing noise of a panicked animal, but something structured, deliberate. The clicks ran in patterns. 3 short, 2 long, a pause, then the sequence repeated. Antonio, who'd spent 15 years on these waters, said it sounded like the echolocation dolphins used, but slower, more complex. The clicking continued for nearly a minute, then it changed. The creature drew breath. They all saw its chest expand and released a high, piercing whistle that climbed in pitch until it passed beyond the range of human hearing. They knew it continued because the deck lights flickered and the navigation equipment emitted a sharp feedback whine. The whistle lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt deliberate. They waited. Marcus had his hand on the radio again. Antonio had backed toward the wheelhouse. The youngest crew member, a kid named Sullivan, who'd signed on 3 months prior, had gone, completely white. The answering call came from the port side, perhaps 200 yards out. It was the same pattern. 3 short clicks, 2 long, then the ascending whistle. Exactly the same. Not similar, identical. A precise echo returned from the empty ocean. Then a second response came from starboard, then a third from the stern. Within 30 seconds, the boat was surrounded by answering calls. 8, maybe 10 distinct sources, all repeating the same sequence the juvenile had produced. They were spaced evenly around the vessel in what could only be described as a perimeter. Sullivan moved first. He grabbed a spotlight from the equipment rack and swept it across the port side, the beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the water below. At first there was nothing, just the black surface of the ocean, the mild chop, the reflected light fragmenting across the waves. Then the shapes appeared. They moved fast, faster than sharks, faster than dolphins, faster than anything that size should move through water. The spotlight caught them only in fragments, a flash of pale skin, the curve of something large, cutting just beneath the surface, a disturbance in the water that suggested mass and speed. Marcus took the spotlight from Sullivan and tracked one of the shapes as it circled the boat. For perhaps 2 seconds, the beam held it steady enough to see. It was big, easily 8 feet long, maybe more. The body had the streamlined power of a marine mammal, but the proportions were wrong. The torso was too long. The shoulders, and they were shoulders, not flippers, were too wide. The thing propelling it through the water wasn't a tail. It was legs, fused or adapted into something that moved with a dolphin's fluidity, but retained the articulation of human limbs. Then it dove, and the spotlight lost it. Sullivan counted at least 7 distinct shapes circling the boat. Antonio thought there were more. They moved in coordinated patterns, crossing paths without collision, maintaining consistent depth and distance. It wasn't the chaotic movement of feeding sharks or curious dolphins. It was tactical, controlled. The juvenile in the net had gone quiet after its initial call. Now it started again. A different sound this time. Not the structured clicking, but something higher, more urgent, almost plaintive. The creatures circling the boat responded immediately. The first impact came against the hull on the starboard side, about 4 feet below the waterline. Not a bump, a strike. Deliberate and forceful enough to make the entire vessel shudder. Tools rolled across the deck. Marcus grabbed the rail to steady himself. 3 seconds later, another impact. Port side, same depth, then another from the stern. They were hitting the boat in sequence, each strike precisely placed, evenly spaced, testing the hull, demonstrating capability. Antonio made it to the wheelhouse and started the engine. Marcus shouted at him to wait, but the older man ignored him. The engine roar split the night, and the boat lurched forward as Antonio pushed the throttle. They made it perhaps 30 yards before something slammed into the rudder, hard enough to knock the wheel from Antonio's hands. The boat slewed sideways. The engine screamed as the propeller hit resistance. Not debris, not a net, but something that fought back. Antonio killed the engine. In the silence that followed, they could hear movement in the water all around them, not breaking the surface, but close to it, displacing enough water that the boat rocked gently in the created swells. Marcus swept the spotlight across the surrounding ocean, and this time the shapes didn't flee the light. They held position, 7, 8, 9 of them. Large forms suspended just beneath the surface, close enough now that the light penetrated the water and revealed details. They had faces, not human faces. The proportions were different. The features adapted for an aquatic environment. But there was structure there that didn't exist in any known marine animal. Eye placement that suggested binocular vision. Facial musculature capable of expression. Intelligence conveyed through posture and the way they held themselves in the water. And they were watching the boat. Not with the blank curiosity of animals, but with focused, unmistakable intent. The juvenile cried out again. The same plaintive sound, growing more distressed. The shapes in the water moved closer. The encounter resists easy dismissal, but that doesn't mean conventional explanations don't exist. The most common skeptical response points to misidentification. The ocean contains species that, under the right conditions, can appear unnervingly humanoid. Seals and sea lions, when glimpsed partially submerged, have elongated bodies and expressive faces that superficially resemble human features. Their foreflippers can suggest arms. Their vocalizations can sound disturbingly infantile. Historically, these animals have been responsible for countless mermaid reports, particularly among exhausted sailors operating in low-light conditions. Dugongs and manatees, large marine mammals with paddle-like tails and rounded, almost human-like faces, have an even stronger claim as the origin of mermaid mythology. Early naturalists explicitly connected these creatures to sailors' tales, noting that their nursing behavior, in which they cradle their young with their flippers while floating upright, could easily be mistaken for a humanoid figure holding a child. Christopher Columbus himself reported seeing mermaids during his first voyage to the Americas, describing them as not as pretty as they are depicted. He was almost certainly looking at manatees. Could the fisherman have hauled up a young seal or a deformed cetacean? Congenital abnormalities do occur in marine mammals. Mutations affecting limb development, facial structure, and body proportions have been documented. A harbor seal pup with unusual flippers, caught in poor light and surrounded by panicked crewmen, might register as something far stranger than it actually was. Then there's the question of group psychology. The human mind, under stress, is capable of profound distortion. Isolation, exhaustion, and the inherent anxiety of deep-sea work create conditions ripe for perceptual error. Folie à deux, shared psychosis, is a recognized phenomenon in which two or more people develop the same delusional belief, typically in situations of close proximity and mutual reinforcement. If one crewman misidentified a marine animal and reacted with alarm, that alarm could spread through the group, amplifying the initial misperception into something far more elaborate. The power of suggestion cannot be overstated. Once one person voices an interpretation, "That's not a seal, look at its face," the others begin searching for confirming details. The brain, cooperative and pattern-seeking, starts to find them. What began as ambiguity solidifies into shared conviction, not through dishonesty, but through the mechanics of human cognition under pressure. And then there is the historical precedent of fabrication. Mermaid hoaxes are as old as seafaring itself. The most famous example, the Fiji mermaid, was a grotesque taxidermied construction, a monkey's torso sewn to a fishtail, that toured Europe and America in the 19th century, presented as genuine remains of a captured mermaid. It was convincing enough to draw enormous crowds and credulous press coverage, despite being an obvious fraud upon close inspection. Fishermen have economic incentives to embellish. A strange catch becomes a local legend, which becomes a tourist attraction, which becomes revenue. Even without conscious intent to deceive, the retelling of an unusual experience can drift toward the fantastical, details sharpening and expanding with each iteration until the original event is unrecognizable. These explanations are reasonable. They account for the vast majority of mermaid sightings throughout history. They should, by all logic, account for this one. But they stumble over certain details. The crew didn't report a fleeting glimpse or a distant shape. They described prolonged, close-range observation of a creature they physically handled. They were experienced fishermen, men who spent their lives identifying marine species in all conditions. A seal pup, even a malformed one, would have been recognized as such. The body structure, the texture of the skin, the behavior, these are things they knew. The shared psychosis theory requires an initial trigger, one person's panic that spreads to the others. But the crew's account describes a progression from confusion to recognition, not from calm to hysteria. They didn't react with fear until after they had examined the juvenile and found it unclassifiable. That's the wrong sequence for suggestive panic. And the hoax angle collapses entirely under the crew's behavior. They didn't seek publicity. They didn't try to profit from the story. They actively avoided attention, knowing the social cost of being labeled as fantasists or liars. That is not the behavior of hoaxers. That is the behavior of witnesses burdened by an experience they can't explain and don't expect others to believe. So the conventional explanations exist. They are well documented and scientifically sound. They explain most cases. but whether they explain this one remains an open question. The fisherman's account exists within a vast, unsettling tapestry. Their terror on that boat wasn't unprecedented. It was the latest thread in a pattern woven across cultures and centuries. Greek sailors spoke of sirens whose songs carried both beauty and threat. Scottish fishermen whispered of selkies, seal folk whose children, if taken, brought savage retribution from the sea. In Japan, catching a ningyo was considered catastrophic. The creature itself was believed valuable, but its capture invited storms, shipwrecks, divine anger from the depths. The details shift across geography and time. The features change. The names multiply. But the core narrative remains constant. Something intelligent lives beneath the surface. It protects its young. And humans who violate that boundary face consequences that transcend rational understanding. These aren't quaint folklore scattered randomly across the globe. They're warnings passed down through generations of people who made their living on the water. People who understood the ocean's power. People who, despite their pragmatism and experience, believed certain lines should never be crossed. The modern account follows the same structure. Accidental capture, recognition of something profoundly wrong, the appearance of guardians, the release, the silence that follows. What transforms this from simple repetition into something more disturbing is the consistency of response. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, the prescribed action is identical. Return what you've taken immediately. Do not keep it. Do not study it. Do not profit from it. The ocean does not negotiate. Perhaps these stories persist because they encode ecological wisdom. Respect marine life. Don't overfish. Acknowledge the sea's power. Perhaps they're collective metaphors for humanity's relationship with nature's boundaries. Or perhaps they persist because the pattern keeps repeating. The fisherman who released that creature joined a lineage of witnesses stretching back millennia. All of them faced the same choice. All of them recognized, in that moment, that they were not the apex predators they believed themselves to be. Whether the fisherman encountered an unknown species, misidentified a known animal under conditions of extreme stress, or experienced something that defies current biological categories, one fact remains undisputed. Their fear was real. They returned to port, changed. They refused to speak openly about what happened at those coordinates. And they never went back to that location. 95% of Earth's oceans remain unexplored. We've mapped the surface of distant planets with greater precision than we've charted our own seafloor. The abyss holds volumes we haven't read, ecosystems we haven't cataloged, and possibly intelligence we haven't acknowledged. The ocean keeps its secrets until we stumble into them. Sometimes it seems those secrets have families, and those families remember trespass. This is Mystery Records. Some questions don't have answers. They have coordinates you don't return to.